She wasn't being punished for killing anyone. She was being punished for talking. Iron presses into her mouth. Her tongue is trapped. Her jaw cannot close. Her saliva runs down the front of her dress. And outside, the street is already filling with people. They came to watch. But that wasn't the worst part. Because in medieval society, pain was never enough. The real goal was to turn one woman into a lesson every other woman would remember. And before this video ends, you'll see why the most terrifying punishment was not drowning, burning, or mutilation. It was what happened after the crowd went home. A woman could be called dangerous for almost nothing, speaking too sharply, refusing a husband, mocking a priest, being accused by a neighbor, knowing too much about herbs, loving the wrong man, not grieving correctly, laughing too loudly, surviving when others wanted her ruined. That was the trap, not crime, disobedience. And disobedience was whatever authority said it was. What kind of life is that? When the rules are unwritten, the punishment can be anything. Imagine the morning beginning with a knock on the door. Not soldiers from some grand battle, local men. Familiar faces. Men who bought bread from your family. Men who nodded to you at church. Men who already think they know what sort of woman you are. They drag you into the street, not because you are the worst person in town, but because you are the most useful example. That is the psychology at the center of all this. A public punishment does two jobs at once. It hurts the victim and it trains the audience. And the first thing a controlled society tries to crush is the female voice. In parts of Britain and Northern Europe, women branded as scolds could be forced into an iron device built for humiliation as much as agony. Picture it closely. A cage around the head, heavy straps, hinges. Sometimes ugly shapes hammered into the metal to make the wearer look monstrous. But the true cruelty sat inside. A hard plate or spike pushed into the mouth, pinning the tongue, forcing silence not by persuasion but by iron. No speech, no defense, no dignity. Only breath, panic, and the sound of footsteps around you. The brilliance of the device, if you can call it that, was psychological. It did not merely stop a woman from speaking. It made speech itself look dangerous. The crowd didn't just see her suffering. They saw a warning attached to the act of having a voice. A girl watching from an upstairs window learned something in that moment. A wife learned something. A daughter learned something. Do not become memorable. Do not become loud. Do not become inconvenient. How many women silenced themselves long before anyone touched them? And that is why these punishments lasted. They moved from the body into the mind. But silence was only the beginning, because if a woman could not be quiet, the next step was to turn her body into an object. Across parts of Central Europe, women called quarrelsome, rebellious, or shrewish could be locked into restraint frames designed to rob them of movement and self-possession. Neck trapped, wrists pinned, back bent forward, balance broken, no dramatic execution, no blood. Something colder, immobilization. The body remains alive, but stripped of autonomy in front of strangers. And sometimes the cruelty became theatrical. Two people who had argued could be locked together, forced face to face, as if humiliation itself were a civic lesson. The public watched not to understand truth, but to enjoy submission. That is another pattern in these punishments. Society pretended they restored order when often they were entertainment, wearing legal clothing. Let that sink in. Your suffering becomes the town's afternoon. What does that do to a person? To know your pain is not a tragedy, but a spectacle. Then came the stool. At first glance, it looks almost absurd. A chair, wood, rope, a beam over water. But history is full of devices that seem almost childish until you picture a human body inside them. A woman is strapped in, tight, arms fixed, skirts soaked with river mist. The crowd gathers at the bank, children on shoulders, men smirking, women whispering. The officials perform calm authority, as if they are only carrying out a routine measure. Then the chair drops. Cold punches the lungs, mud enters the mouth, the world becomes bubbles, brown water, and blind terror. She comes up coughing, trying to breathe, trying to understand how many more times this will happen. Then down again, and again, and again. This was not just punishment, it was controlled drowning with an audience, a machine for panic, a ritual built around the body's oldest instinct, survive. And the logic behind it was even worse. In some places, survival could be twisted into proof of guilt, while death arrived carrying the label of innocence. So what was the trial really? It was not search for truth. It was an arranged collision between fear and authority. Sometimes a victim was not plunged into water first. She was paraded through town, strapped to a chair, or made to trudge under a ridiculous burden, while the community spat out its own anxieties at her. Rotten food, laughter, slurs, hands pointing, faces pretending righteousness while enjoying cruelty. Public shaming worked because human beings are terrified of social death. Physical pain ends, but humiliation spreads. It follows you home. It lives in memory. It alters how people look at you tomorrow. And if punishment becomes a memory people can repeat, it keeps punishing long after the device is removed. This is where medieval control becomes disturbingly modern. What hurts more, the moment you are attacked or the knowledge that everyone saw it? Some punishments were built to make a person look absurd. A heavy cask over the body, a forced walk through the streets. Every step clumsy, every movement transformed into ridicule. The message was simple and vicious. We will not only hurt you, we will make you look contemptible while we do it. That matters, because once the victim looks ridiculous, the crowd feels less guilty. Mockery is a shortcut to moral permission. If you can make someone appear foolish, shameless, dirty, or other, then many people will stop seeing them as fully human. And once that happens, almost anything can be justified. That was not medieval ignorance alone. That was human psychology exploited with ruthless efficiency. Then, history becomes even darker. Because there were women the authorities did not merely want to shame, they wanted to mark as unnatural, during which persecutions, accusation itself became a trapdoor. A mole could become evidence. A scar could become evidence. A birthmark could become evidence. Your own skin could testify against you if frightened people wanted it to. Officials or self-appointed experts searched bodies for so-called marks of evil. Then came the pricking, needles against flesh. Again, 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 looking for a place that seemed numb or bloodless or wrong. But some accusers cheated. Retractable needles, staged demonstrations, tricks that guaranteed a guilty outcome. In other words, the trial did not discover fear. Fear designed the trial. And imagine the victim's mind in that moment. If she cries out, she looks suspicious. If she does not cry out, she looks unnatural. If she trembles, she is unstable. If she stays calm, she is cold. Every human reaction becomes usable against her. How do you defend yourself inside a system that feeds on interpretation? Some places believed a bewitched person could be relieved if the accused woman was scratched until she bled. Think about the inversion there. Violence against the suspect becomes proof that the suspect caused the illness in the first place. Pain is transformed into evidence. This is why these stories are so hard to watch, not because they are merely brutal, but because they reveal how easily a frightened community can turn ritual into truth. One rumor, one failed harvest, one dead child. One woman already seen as difficult, solitary, poor, older, clever, foreign, infertile, widowed, or simply unprotected. That could be enough. History's cruelty often begins where social loneliness meets public fear. And for some women, humiliation was not enough. The body itself was altered, parts cut away, parts destroyed, parts taken so the punishment would remain visible forever. Across different times and states, women accused of sexual wrongdoing, theft, or other crimes could be mutilated in ways designed to outlast the sentence. Feet removed, noses cut off, faces disfigured. Not random violence, but symbolic violence. Why the nose? Why the face? Because the face meets the world first. Destroy the face and you do not just injure the body. You ruin identity, marriage prospects, status, safety, and social standing all at once. A wound becomes biography. A mutilated woman carried the accusation with her every day after. She no longer needed a court, a crier, or a platform. Her body had become the announcement. That is one of the most chilling features of pre-modern punishment. Authorities wanted penalties that kept speaking after the official act was over. Not enough to hurt. The hurt had to linger in public view. Would you ever feel clean again if your society turned your face into a permanent verdict? Sometimes the permanent mark was not mutilation, but visible shame. A sewn symbol, a branded sign, a public identifier attached to clothing or flesh. Something meant to say to everyone, before you speak to this woman, know what she is. Notice the trick hidden inside that practice. The state no longer has to punish her every day. The community will do it for free. Neighbors will stare. Employers will hesitate. Suitors will vanish. Children will hear stories. The punishment escapes the scaffold and settles into ordinary life. That is how systems of control become efficient when the crowd begins doing the work. And not every punishment spilled blood. Some were colder than blood. Exile. Loss of dowry. Loss of remarriage rights. Loss of inheritance. Loss of rank. Loss of legitimacy. Loss of the future you thought belonged to your children. For elite or noble women, reputation could be as fragile as glass. Once broken, it shattered more than romance. It shattered alliances, property, family ambition, and dynastic security. In some societies, a woman accused of sexual misconduct could lose standing so completely that her descendants carried the stain. Imagine that. The law not content with crushing one life, but reaching forward into children not yet born. That is not punishment. That is historical contamination. And here is the part many viewers miss. These punishments were not randomly cruel. They were incredibly precise. If a woman's crime was speaking, the mouth was targeted. If her crime was defiance, the body was restrained. If her crime was sexuality, the face, clothing, marriage, and fertility were targeted. If her crime was influence, her reputation was poisoned. If her crime threatened lineage, her descendants paid too. This was social engineering written onto flesh. Each punishment answered the same hidden question: what part of a woman must be controlled to keep the larger order stable? And that larger order was built on fear. Not just male fear of women as individuals, though that mattered. Fear of disorder, fear of scandal, fear of uncertain paternity, fear of inheritance chaos, fear of public mockery, fear of female speech spreading dissent through homes, neighborhoods, and bloodlines. A society can tolerate many things. What it rarely tolerates is anyone who reveals how fragile its authority really is. So the disobedient woman became a perfect target. She could absorb everyone's panic at once. And the crowd mattered as much as the law. Always remember that. These punishments needed witnesses. Without witnesses, a bridal is just pain, a ducking stool is just terror, a public brand is just injury. But with witnesses, they become civic theater. The crowd completes the punishment. Children learn where power lives. Husbands learn what tools authority will tolerate. Wives learn what rebellion costs. Officials appear strong. Gossip becomes policy. Fear passes from eye to eye. Would these punishments have worked if nobody watched? Probably not half as well. That is why the square, the riverbank, the procession route, the market road mattered so much. Control had to be seen. But now we reach the answer to the mystery from the beginning. What was worse than the iron, the drowning, the mutilation? What kept these systems alive for centuries? It was not the device. It was the conversion of pain into obedience. A woman punished in public did not suffer alone. Her neighbors absorbed the lesson. Her daughters absorbed the lesson. Even women never touched by the law began adjusting themselves in anticipation. Speak less, question less, desire less, stand out less. Become smaller before someone smaller-minded makes you pay for not doing it. That is the deepest horror here. The system did not need to punish every woman. It only needed to punish enough women that the rest would help enforce the cage themselves. And when the crowd went home, the punishment kept going. In the silence after the shouting, a woman still had to wake the next day inside the same village, with the same eyes on her, the same rumors, the same damaged future. Maybe her husband now saw her as a burden. Maybe her children heard the whispers. Maybe employers avoided her. Maybe the next accusation would come easier because the town had already learned how to enjoy her humiliation. That is why social punishment can outlive physical pain. Bruises fade. A public identity does not. And there is something else deeply unsettling. Many of these women were not singled out because they were powerful. They were singled out because they were exposed. Poor women. Widows. Women without male protection. Women with sharp tongues but weak networks. Women disliked by neighbors. Women whose grief, sexuality, age, poverty, or isolation made them easy to narrate as dangerous. In other words, punishment often followed vulnerability, not guilt. That should make us uncomfortable because it means cruelty did not always strike the strongest threat. It often struck the easiest target. How different is that from the way public shaming still works now? No, modern life is not medieval law. But human instincts travel well through time. Crowds still enjoy moral spectacle. Reputation can still be destroyed in public. Women are still judged for tone, sexuality, anger, ambition, and visibility in ways men often are not. Social exile still works. Humiliation still spreads faster than truth. And once people believe a woman is that kind of woman, they often reinterpret everything she does through that label. Different tools, similar hunger. That is why this history matters. Not because it lets us feel superior to the past, but because it exposes mechanisms that have never fully vanished. Look back at that mask from the opening. The iron in the mouth is horrifying. But more horrifying is the idea beneath it, that a woman's voice could be treated as a public danger requiring physical correction. Once a culture accepts that principle, the rest follows almost naturally. Restraints, dunking, marking, mutilation, exile, erasure, one belief, many technologies of control. And if you've made it this far, you already know this was never only about punishment. It was about ownership, about deciding who gets to define virtue, whose body carries community panic, and who pays when order feels threatened. If you value history told with the darkness left in, like this video, subscribe to the History in Fact and hit like, because the past becomes dangerous when it is cleaned up, simplified, or made comfortable. So what did women suffer for disobedience in medieval society? Sometimes iron, sometimes water, sometimes knives, sometimes exile, sometimes a whole town trained to hate them. But the cruelest punishment of all may have been this: to survive the sentence and then spend the rest of your life living inside its echo. And maybe that is the final reason these stories still grip us. They force a brutal question. If you had lived there, would you have resisted? Or would you have lowered your eyes, joined the crowd, and called it order?